That's up in the air. Pakistan win the World Cup.
What a great delivery.
In the air, gone!
Good morning. Welcome to our latest edition of the In the Clinic podcast. With me in the clinic today is Ahmer Naqvi. He is a journalist who follows cricket, music, food. He's a ardent supporter of sports. You would have seen him on the coverage of the FIFA World Cup, where his commentary on the German national team went viral in multiple languages across the globe. Ahmer, thank you for doing this. Hope you're doing well.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So for our generation, obviously, and you can see with what I'm wearing, Pakistan cricket and the fandom basically starts with that amazing Ramzan of 1992, where it seemed like all hope was lost, and then basically all hell broke loose. And what came about was basically the crystallization of so many things, which is basically even socio-politically has basically affected Pakistan since 92. Take us through your memories of the 92 World Cup, what you remember best, and what is it about 92 that every ICC tournament or World Cup we sort of try and tie back into 92? You're already hearing about Naseem Shah being injured is the same as Waqar Younis being injured. Go ahead.
I think over the last few years, this was something I started thinking about during the lockdown. And I was really thinking about like why we follow sports, right? And I think up until then, a lot of times I just kind of assumed that, this is what this is a fun thing to do. And okay, maybe I'm addicted to watching Pakistan play, etc. Because, particularly the era that I've been working as a professional journalist or content creator, whatever, Pakistan had a pretty rough time of it. We were in exile, and we had a team that was not able to play against the top sides, and when it did, it usually wasn't playing that well, particularly in white ball cricket. So there's a lot of famine, and yet obviously I was still following, and I was trying to think about like why we follow. And I think increasingly I've come to realize that sports are a way for us to there's this amazing narrative that we follow, and it gives us meaning. And as such, I think the 92 World Cup for Pakistan obviously is very significant because 92, 2009, 2017, there's no one that overlaps on these three title-winning sides for Pakistan. But remarkably, they play each tournament almost exactly the same way, right? Yep. So there's this like Greek idea of like Theseus's ship, where they bring this ship back from the Odyssey, and then after a while the mast has to be repaired, so they replace the mast, and then the body has to be repaired, so and eventually it's like, is this still the real ship, or is it now something new? And sports teams are like that as well, right? Like what you had in 92 and what you have in 2009, what you have in 2017 are like completely different people, different eras, different times. But in each case, Pakistan starts with some shocking defeats and then needs to win every match and needs to have other matches go their way. And then they have like an exciting knockout match, and then they somehow win against all the odds. And there's like major players missing because of injury or this drama or that drama. So 92 then becomes like the origin myth in right. that sense for Pakistani fandom. And then I think even in the larger context of cricket, 92 is the first World Cup that's played under lights, that's played in colored clothing. So it's really the start of cricket's modern era. So even other people looking back at it are there is a before and after kind of situation with that World Cup. And again, like broadcasting of matches becomes a lot more ubiquitous as well. So again, you're like able to have a lot more clips of that World Cup that you can watch later on in life. And I think finally that it's this tendency to kind of, this happened, that happened. Right now in Argentina, when they won this World Cup, throughout that World Cup, they kept having these conversations about this also happened in 1986, that
86,
also
sure.
happened in 1986, right? So there's that very natural. That's why I talked about narrative, because people will come back to that more than anything else. Like people aren't saying like, oh, in 1986 we were playing 4-4-2 in Argentina, or that, oh, in 1992 Pakistan had
It's the
seven bowlers.
stories.
Like people are talking about, yeah, they're not talking about uh the tactics and everything that define a game. What they're talking about is the memories, the story, the plot, the narrative.
And that's the beauty of sports. I've always said sports is the greatest reality TV show because one, it's completely unscripted. In the NFL, you're an NFL fan. Obviously, there's the saying "any given Sunday," but also it brings about this visceral sort of emotions and connection. So the Champions Trophy, for example, you mentioned that. To me, the Champions Trophy really resonated with me because it was on Father's Day. My dad was here. I just had my son was just born, and so there you make these emotional human connections to sports events, which you then link to basically your daily life. And it's amazing how your sports team can basically almost the weekends revolve and your moods revolve around it. I'm also happen to be a Manchester United fan, so obviously yesterday was not the best. This past weekend wasn't the greatest. We spoke earlier about the NFL team I follow, but it's this weird thing whereby it doesn't matter how much we lose, the hope springs eternal. We go to, for example, the heartbreak of 96 and of course 99. Let's talk about 99. Is 99 by far and away the most talented team that we've had? And has that been the biggest disappointment as a fan? Because for you and I, we were late teens, early adolescents at that point. I was about 18, 19. I'm sure you were a similar age. And that's sort of peak passion, fandom, knowledge, that was a fantastic team. And yet, it popped like a balloon. Talk to me about the heartbreak of that.
Yeah, so I had turned 16 that summer. So yeah, it was a very kind of, I think I look back at it as the loss of innocence. That was, I think, before I was like a child, and I think that World Cup kind of made you grow up, um, in the sense. In the sense, like I feel, I was, in the aftermath, a lot of people continue to believe that was a fixed game.
Sure.
So you also had to deal with like that, again, like a very adult thing to deal
Yep.
with.
And you
First,
finally had a foil, right? You always need an anti-hero, and you had the Australian cricket team show up at that time as well, which adds
yeah,
to the narrative of the story because they went on from that 99 World Cup to then win serial World Cups in the 2000s.
yeah,
Um,
I think that was what I was going to say, that when you actually look back at how Australia similarly dismantled once in a generation Indian, Sri Lankan, and New Zealand teams in subsequent World Cup finals, I think you can then maybe have a little bit more sympathy for that 99 side. Like, even like fix or not, like Australia did the same to everyone else also. And then that year also was really an iconic year for Pakistan cricket because we toured India and we were in Australia, and like um, all kinds of really crazy matches happened. And by during the World Cup only, the Kargil war had started, and by the end of the year, the military took over, and so it was a extremely, like, I think, pivotal year in Pakistan's history. And so the World Cup being such an evocative part of it, I think just adds to that romance and tragedy of that World Cup.
it also goes to what I've always thought of Pakistan cricket. To use, John Winthrop wrote this when he was leaving as a pilgrim to come to America, but America as a city on a hill. And then, of course, Kennedy and Reagan both mentioned this shining city on a hill in presidential campaigns of Pakistan cricket being sort of the city on the hill about Pakistan in general. It's a country that's had, since independence, basically trials and tribulations, and yet sort of this is the cricket aspect of it, is the shining city on the hill. It's what we all in the diaspora, those who live there, look up to, and so a lot of the World Cups seem to be sort of tied in to that notion. They always seem to be mixed in. You mentioned reference the Cargill War in 99, and then the wilderness years which followed following the attack on Sri Lanka in 2009. And you had this basically period of where in cricket wilderness, but also in World Cup wilderness, you had the debacle where Bob Wilmer passed away, you lost to Ireland, so on and so forth. Touch upon that, and do you how do you feel about how we look upon cricket as this beacon on a hill?
I think that's an interesting metaphor, and I don't know enough about American politics, but I would say that you're talking about a metaphor that was used by Kennedy and Reagan, and they definitely represent like the mainstream of America. But within America itself, there's a significant amount of populations, native and formerly enslaved, that are not part of
Correct, but
that
they were
concept.
talking about American exceptionalism.
Which is why I'm also talking about in Pakistan, cricket represents it represents the mainstream. It represents the status quo, and so historically, it was cricketers, and the cricket infrastructure was Lahore and Karachi. In the 90s, it expands to small town Punjab. And in the 2010s, it establishes itself in KPK. But even now, when you look at Sindh, Shahnawaz Dhani in 2021 was the first Sindhi speaker to play for the national side in like 75 years. And you have no one who's Baloch who's played or anywhere near to playing for Pakistan. And so cricket is really interesting in the sense that out of all the possible symbols of the status quo mainstream nationhood, it is the most inclusive. So it still has people across social classes and across gender. Pakistan's blind team, for example, has had some sort of recognition, while other differently abled Pakistanis in any walk of life are not represented in mainstream. So cricket is, like that's why I said it's when you gave that metaphor, it's interesting because we have to understand it primarily as a representation of the mainstream. But when you look at everything else in Pakistan that represents Pakistaniism or whatever, they're far more narrow. Whether it comes to like the dominant language, where it comes to the dominant faith, where it comes to dominant ideas of what Pakistani food is, what Pakistani this or that is, those are very limited kind of things, right? And so Pakistani cricket is also limiting, but it has the widest limits of all of these ideas. And so I think that's where it becomes interesting, because like you mentioned the diaspora, right? So the diaspora, generalizing extremely here, has 2-3 obsessions. For example, their relationship with religion obviously varies, but it tends to be quite significant. And that may or may not be true for for a lot of other Pakistanis living in Pakistan, or their relationship with like international politics or whatever. But when it comes to cricket, there's more of like a common ground, right? Like there is and then you see the same with like rural versus urban divide in Pakistan, the social class divide in Pakistan. Like cricket is the only way that a poor person can become rich in Pakistan legally.
It provides upward social mobility.
There's no other way you can do it. It's just like you can do it illegally, but you cannot do it legally. And so that's something really, really powerful and significant. And yet I think there is a tendency to get carried away and see it as this all encompassing thing, and that it's not. And it's important to see. So, for example, a cricket stadium being built in Gwadar is not reflective of cricket becoming more popular. It's
Correct.
reflective of state looking to mark its presence in an area where it's not very present or popular.
No, I think you touch upon a good point, is that it provides upward social mobility, something that in sports, certainly in other countries, you see that. You look at the experience of certainly minority populations in the US and how sports has basically led to upward social mobility. And I think that's very closely tied to basically this blind fandom that we have. Um, what is it about the way that we play and the way that we win, and how does that tie into the identity? Because, Nasser Hussain mentioned it, I think, put it most eloquently in the 2017 Champions Trophy final, down 1 minute, up the other. That seems to be, mercurial is always the most common adjective when anyone writes about Pakistan cricket. Why is that the case?
I think that it's very difficult to be able to, pin this down in a way that um, that is like easy to understand. I think, in my opinion, the best writing in cricket and definitely on Pakistan cricket was when Usman Samiuddin talks about Pakistan team getting into a state of hal or transcendental phase. And that's such a beautiful idea because it takes something that's very rooted in our culture and kind of identifies it across different art forms, and sports is, in my
Art,
opinion,
absolutely. Yes.
um, I think that if you want to go with a more boring, rational kind of answer, I think the other thing also is that um, in cricket, you have ultimately batting is how you decide who wins or loses, because it's like who has more runs.
Right.
That's the bottom line, you know. And by and large, batting is what we're paying attention to. That's how we're marking the score and everything. And so that's batting is a way of kind of building up offense, and bowling is a way of restricting it or defending it or cutting into it. And I think that if you are looking to be a side that's like better at bowling, then you are more liable to cause like bigger swings in the match, right? So like if you're chasing 250 and you hit six sixes in an over, yeah, that really changes things up. But like maybe if you hit like 13 runs in the 25th over, that doesn't significantly alter the match. But in the 25th over, if you take a hat trick, that's 30% of the
Right.
wickets gone. So that swing is bigger. So I think like that's the other thing, that when you look at sides that tend to lead with their bowling, then they will have a greater tendency of creating bigger narrative shocks, because bowling by its nature can either not do much or very quickly change like things, versus with batting, it's more incremental. So I think that's two ways of looking at it. That this is something that's very intrinsic to our culture. Like, I spoke to Wasim Akram about this, and he said, if our society is inconsistent, then you would expect
Our cricket to
the
be.
team to be consistent as well. I think, you have Usman, who takes a very beautiful, poetic approach to it. But again, it's what he's talking about is something that's, that's kind of going outside the realm of like tactics and more into like a very visceral kind of space, which again is, there's a lot of precedent for that in sports,
Yes.
being in the zone,
The
you
other
know.
thing recently, Matthew Hayden did an interview where he talked about the rawness of talent. And he spoke about, in Australia, he called them players from the bushlands. They come in, they're taught to play cricket by village elders, and basically have raw talent that has to be harnessed. Pakistan, this has been discussed ad nauseum, the lack of a structure, grassroots level of cricket. So you have these players who basically have raw talents and they come together. And so rawness of talents will always have those bigger deltas in performance because they're not honed and structured in sort of into a box whereby now your variation is not going to be as much. And I think that also has something to do. We can have the highest of highs, but also the lowest of lows because of the way our teams are constructed. As you mentioned, it is now not a team that from basically came out of the elite of society in the 70s and 80s. It's now basically in KPK, it's in interior Sindh. You have players who are coming from all walks of life, from all socioeconomic lives. And so obviously their talent and their skills and the skills and the techniques that they've come in with aren't as sort of boxed in.
Yeah, I think like if you look at football, um, so this was obviously most famous for Latin America, was true for like many parts of the world, where uh, kids who are growing up there, who are learning football in the slums, or learning football in the inner cities, so they're playing in like cramped areas and on concrete or asphalt, and so they pick up a lot of different sort of skills. I think we really underrate how big tape ball cricket is in Pakistan. Like there isn't really an analog for any cricket variant in another cricket nation the way we have tape ball in Pakistan, which is really well organized. It's really extensive, and obviously you're again picking up like with tape ball cricket. It's a very almost binary kind of sport where you're either going for the boundaries or you're going for the wickets, and there's not much else in between. So again, that I think is particularly over the last like 20 years or something, almost everyone who's playing cricket professionally in Pakistan has played a lot of tape ball cricket, is unavoidable. And again, that has an impact. I think we really underrate that impact. But if nothing else, on both the skills and the mentality, it is encouraging like a more boom or bust kind of approach.
Last topic. There's this notion that in sports, to win, you have to suffer first. Obviously, this current iteration of this team has had missed chances in the 2021 and 2022 T20 World Cups. Have they suffered enough? Have we as fans suffered enough? Can we potentially see a victory come next month?
So uh, I've been working in cricket for a while, and one of the major drawbacks of working in it is that you really lose a lot of that joy of fandom. So to give you an example, when you're working in cricket, it's your job and it's a close match. Um, this happened a few times, like the team that's chasing has collapsed and they're never going to get there, but then the eighth wicket is like playing and it's playing and it's playing, and if you're a fan, you're like, oh man, this match is actually getting fun. When you're working in it, you're like, man, I need to go home. Why aren't
Yes,
these
I
guys
need
getting?
my editor
So
needs
your,
to, yeah.
yeah, your relationship switches. And so for me, a few years ago, I started following other sports a lot more just to connect as a fan. And I started following American sports a lot. And I really enjoy them, but also that Americans are really good at providing you all the highlights and all the analysis and
We love that.
everything possibly want, you have it. Not like in cricket where you're finding some fucking 144p footage of an
Yes.
extremely important event that no one has rights to. Um, and when I started following American sports, I was just like, my God, I used to think that we have to suffer a lot as Pakistani fans, but we're doing pretty well. Like,
Oh
I
yeah,
could have
you speak to Detroit
uh,
Lions fans,
Jets fan,
Cleveland Browns fans,
Lions fan,
myself as a
Bills
Miami
fan.
Dolphins fans, Bulls fans, Dallas Cowboys fans. It's yeah, suffering here is it's different though because I think in a city, and especially in a big city where you have multiple franchises, the thought is that if you one of those teams wins, you should be okay
Yeah,
for
अच्छा,
3 to 5 years.
Buffalo Bills ले लो, 4 लगातार सुपर बोल्स हारे,
Correct. Then
फिर
you're
अभी
okay.
Mahomes से जलील हुए, Burrow से जलील हुए. So
Correct.
you can take like my point is, we take the Knicks for example, bro. Like,
I haven't won since '71.
yeah,
But Knicks fans are also Yankee fans who have won. The one as recently as 2009. Yes, you have.
so fair. But I think the point that I guess I'm trying to make is that like if you're getting a world title every 10, 12 years,
That's
that's
pretty
that's
good.
pretty that's pretty good. And I think like that context to me is like, okay, cool. Pakistan definitely has the lowest of the lows. There's no kind of doubting that. Um, but I think we get a lot of enjoyment. And I think the other thing I realized was, when I did get kind of start getting sick of cricket, or then you realize that actually cricket fans are making do with like absolute bullshit, because like there's no context to the games we follow, right? So like, okay, there's a World Cup and Champions Trophy and World T20. Fine. These three things have like, when they're gonna happen, and they have some context, and everyone plays everyone. But for the rest of the
In
four
the middle, it's
years,
all yes. It's just a jumble of hodgepodge.
Pakistan beat South Africa and South Africa's beat Australia, but Australia's like, what does this mean? There's no who's on top, who's on bottom, who's showing improvement. It doesn't matter. And we put up with this. And we've put up with this for like 150 years. And we put up with, the big three just playing with each other. We put up with test matches having no context. We put up with bilaterals having no context, no consequences. And Pakistan में कभी वो practice match चल रहा है तो उस पे भी पूरी
Yes,
आवाम
of
पागल
course,
होती
we
है.
have to. But
So
I will say that though, you mentioned winning others. I do think that there is a difference between 2009 and 2017 compared to winning an ICC ODI, because I think it's the pinnacle of an ICC event is that ODI 50 over World Cup. And
I
I
mean, I feel you and I think that because we've grown up with the 50 over World Cup. I think like someone 20 years older than us might have a different opinion,
different opinion.
and
They may
someone
think test matches.
20 years
Sure.
younger
No, I
than
think
us
that's
have
a
a different
fair
opinion.
thing. Any last words? I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I appreciate it.
Uh, I mean, yeah, like I think win or lose, this is a journey that I think most of us will be on for a while. And given that you've mentioned that you support Man U and you live in Dallas, so you already have a lot of sins that you need to
Yes.
cleanse the Pakistan team. So I feel like that's how God's evening. Because you were saying like you have to suffer before you win. But if I'm not wrong, when you were a kid, basically the Cowboys were winning and United was winning and
Oh,
Pakistan was winning.
but no, but as a kid, United didn't win the first league title till 92, 93, and I had to put up
So
with basically the
I'm sorry
Buffalo
for
Bills
us.
crushing
What
my
guilt.
my favorite player of all time, Dan Marino, every single year in the Super Bowl, because we could never beat Jim Kelly and Terman Thomas and Andre Reed and Bruce Smith, and you can tell I'm still
Wasn't
scarred
it the Super
because
Bowl? That was like the conference game.
those were, but in the playoffs, yeah, we could never
Yeah.
get to an actual
So,
Super
so in
Bowl.
that sense,
It
Pakistan's
has
given
given me more.
the most joy.
Plus, my
Um,
Yankees and my Miami Heat have given me a lot as well over the years, so I can't complain
oh
too
man,
much.
you really need the Pakistani fandom. You otherwise support the worst teams in the world.
Hey, you can't pick the teams
I
you follow. The teams that follow pick you. So,
I guess I guess so. But yeah, thanks for having me on,
no,
and best of luck to Team Pakistan.
thank you very much.